Hello once again, my dear children. We ended up looking at sex-linked inheritance in the last video. And just to make it clear, sex-linked inheritance is where the allele is carried on the gonosomes or the sex chromosome. In particular, I told you with regards to grade 12 syllabus, the allele is carried on the X sex chromosome. So we'll normally denote a male as being X to the capital DY or X to the small dy, no allele on the Y sex chromosome, and a female having X to the capital D, X to the capital D, or X to the capital D, X to the small d, or X to the small d, X to the small d. And I hope you've been practicing, because there are several questions on sex-linked inheritance. Will they appear again? Your guess is as good as mine. The bottom line in life sciences, you got to know everything. Talking about everything, we're looking at the last type of inheritance, and that's the inheritance of blood groups. Now, everything we discussed thus far is controlled by one gene having two alleles. Like one gene controlling the characteristic of seed shape, and the seed shape could either be oval or round. Okay, so oval and round are the two versions in which the shape of the seed could appear. Those are the two versions. So that would be the two alleles. The characteristic is shape of seed. The two alleles is an allele for roundness and allele for ovalness. Okay, so let's take another characteristic. Another characteristic being like color of flower. No, that's one characteristic. What are the two versions in which it can appear? Red or white. So there'll be an allele for redness and allele for whiteness. That we grasp from all the prior lessons. But blood groups, oh my God, this is a unique one because it is controlled by one gene, but it does not have two alleles. It has got three possible alleles. And only two of these will be found inside of you. But there are three to choose from in the entire human population. Okay, so very importantly, this one gene has three alleles, not two, and we call these multiple alleles. Now, because there are three alleles and not two, you come up with different phenotypes. In this case, 4 different phenotypes. And those phenotypes are the blood groups. For example, I am blood group O. What are you? It is important that you know your blood group. And if you don't, find out. I am known as a universal donor, so if you need blood, I am the one who can donate blood. Universal donors can donate blood to anybody. Okay, so let's look at how these blood groups arise. Remember, we said there are 3 possible alleles. Are you with me? But only 2 will be in a person. So let's look at a combination of 2 here. So I can have 1:A combined with 1:B. Those 2 can be in a person. 1:A combined with I. Those 2 can be in a person. 1:B combined with I. Those 2 can be in a person. Can you think of any other combination? While you're thinking, let me just show you the reason why I use a capital A here and a capital B there and a small I here. Reason being is that this allele and that allele are co-dominant. So when they both appear in a person, that person will have blood group AB. So 1:A, 1:B genotype will give me a blood group AB. This little one is a recessive allele. It is recessive to 1:B. It's also recessive to 1:A. What on earth does it mean? It means that if a person has 1:AI, the person will have blood group A. If the person has 1:BI, the person will have blood group B. The only time the person can have blood group O, like me, will be when you have 2 I's, II, 2 recessive alleles. So now let's just look at this. The possible genotypes and phenotypes, my dear children. And Very importantly, there seems to be a little problem. Let's see if we can access this here. And if we cannot, then we will just do a recap of this here and then go on to looking at a particular problem. Okay, so my babies, if you blood group A, if you are blood group A, which are the possible genotypes you could be? Think about it. If you are blood group A, what are the possible genotypes you could be? Yes, 1:A, 1:A to be blood group A, or 1:AI. If you 1:A, 1:A, in words you'd be homozygous A, but that is how you draw your genotype. In words you'd be heterozygous A, means you got two different alleles. The same would be in blood group B. You could be homozygous B, having two identical alleles, or heterozygous B, having two different alleles. But if you are blood group AB, you can only have one genotype, 1:A, 1:B. And if you're homozygous O, but you can only be homozygous for blood group O, and you'd have two I's. Okay, so those are the different blood groups. Now let's try and find a problem. Let's try and find a problem that we can look at to see how we can apply what we have learned. Okay, my darlings? So let's look at this particular one. Let's make this problem a little bigger. Okay. A baby was kidnapped from a hospital immediately after she was born. 15 years later, it was discovered that Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, who were raising her, were not her biological parents. Biological parents are parents who give birth to you. Mr. and Mrs. George, whose baby was born around the same time, claimed that she was their child. So this baby was their child. Could it be right? Could Mr. and Mrs. George be right? Let's look at it. The baby is blood group O. If the baby is blood group O, my darlings, let's just try and write down what her genotype could be. Let's write down what her genotype could be. So if she is blood group O, what is it possible? There's only one possible genotype for being blood group O, II. So she needed two I's. In other words, she needed one recessive allele from one parent and one recessive allele from the other parent. Are you with me? Okay. Mr. Thomas is also II because he's blood group O. Mrs. Thomas is AB. Now, if Mrs. Thomas is AB, she's 1:A, 1:B. Okay. Mr. George, what is Mr. George? Mr. George is blood group B. Now, if he's blood group B, I told you, very often if you're looking at blood group B, my darlings, you're looking at the heterozygous form of blood group B, and because that gives you a greater variety. And the heterozygous form is 1:B. Can't fit the B, I'm just going to write down a small b, babies, or a B next to it. 1:B. Of course, it is supposed to be written as a superscript, okay? So be 1:BI. And if you're looking at Mrs. George, always I said to you, write down the one with the greater variety, because if you blood group A, you can be homozygous A, or you can be heterozygous A, isn't that so? So I want to write down heterozygous A. So there we go. Okay, so let's leave a space there. All right, good. So here we've got the child who's II, blood group O. Mr. Thomas is also II. Mrs. Thomas is AB. Now you would see that there's no possibility of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas being the parents. How come, my darlings? How come there's no possibility of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas being the parents? Because for the child to be II or receive two recessive alleles, she needed to get one I from Mr. Thomas and one I from Mrs. Thomas. Please, these are not the physical eyes that we're talking about. We're talking about the recessive allele. So she needed to get one recessive allele from Mr. Thomas and one recessive allele from Mrs. Thomas. Now, there's no way that Mr. and Mrs. Thomas could be the parents, because while Mr. Thomas was also II, so he could have given her one I. Are you with me? Although he was II, he would have given one I to the child, one recessive allele. This Mrs. Thomas is 1:A, 1:B. She's got no recessive allele. So there's no way she could have given the other recessive allele. Therefore, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas could never be the parents. Why could Mr. and Mrs. George be the parents? Always when they're looking at questions like these, my darling, make sure that you put the heterozygous form to get out the greatest variety of genotype. So could Mr. and Mrs. George be the parents? Yes, because Mr. George has got an I to give, a recessive allele I, and Mrs. George has got a recessive allele I to give. So therefore, Mr. and Mrs. George could possibly be the parents. Notice I didn't say they are the parents. They could possibly be the parents. To finally find out whether they are the parents, you'll take the DNA fingerprint of the child. You'll take the DNA fingerprint of Mr. George, take the DNA fingerprint of Mrs. George, and do a comparison of the DNA fingerprint to see if they've got many of those bars in common to make your final decision about who are really the parents of this child who was kidnapped 15 years ago. I hope that makes things clearer. There are so many other questions on blood group. Kindly go through them, and God bless, my dear children.